8 rental properties across 3 states. We built most of that portfolio over the last 7 years. And we did that while we also had 3 kids during that time. It kind of ended up to where I only had about 20 to 30 minutes a day to actually spend time on it.
Welcome back to the 20-Minute Investor, the show that helps time-strapped professionals build real estate wealth in 20 minutes a day without quitting their job or sacrificing family. In this episode, I'm sharing a conversation with my mentor, Coach Carson, where I go through the 20-minute investor system and how to use it to reach big, audacious real estate goals with very little time. Coach Carson is the author of Bigger Pockets' best-selling book, The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor. He's helped coach hundreds of investors as they start their own real estate journeys and has been an enormous influence on my growth as an investor. You'll walk away from this episode with a brand new weekly planning habit, a flexible 20-minute daily task management framework, and a clear method for turning long-term goals into simple weekly actions. Hope you enjoy, and as a quick reminder, if you find yourself wanting more, you can join my free school community at aaronamin.com/school. That's SKOOL. Now here's my interview with Coach Carson.
So Aaron, we're recording this towards the end of the year, right around it's around holiday time. And I don't know about you, but like this is the time of year I start thinking about goal setting and how can I achieve some big, huge, audacious goals in 2026. That's on my mind. And yet, I think a lot of people maybe relate to this when they're listening to this. They have these big goals and they remember the goals they set last year, but there's this reality of when you get into the year, you don't really have that much time. There's a lot of time constraints. There's a lot of, things kind of fall off the wagon in terms of energy and just always, they never seem to materialize exactly like you set the goals in December. So I'd love to hear let people know a little bit about your story because you're a fellow real estate investor with me. We're in rental property mastery together. You're one of the coaches in our community, and you also have a lot of other roles. So tell people about kind of how the kinds of things you're juggling in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me back. I'm honored to be a return guest. And a little bit about me. So I'm Aaron Amin. My wife and I and my family live in Houston, Texas. We own 8 rental properties across 3 states. We built most of that portfolio over the last 7 years. And we did that while we also had 3 kids during that time. So we have a 4-year-old and then 2-year-old twins. And I've been working full time throughout that as well. So as Chad kind of alluded to, definitely been managing a few different things at the same time, all while building that portfolio and trying to do it in a sustainable way where I can still spend as much time with my family as possible and still grow in my career. So as with anything, multitasking and, is thought of in different ways now than it was in the past, but there are ways to do it. And I think we're going to talk about some of those. And to your point on the holiday time, it's actually one of my favorite times of the year. It's an interesting time though, because there's a lot of emotions, like you said, where you have whatever feelings you have about the year that you're in, how you set your goals, last year and how you performed relative to those goals. There's also a lot of exhaustion and just different emotions people carry into this time of the year where it's hard sometimes to recenter and zoom out and think big picture because we also need to rest and recover. Oh. So I do think it's a critical period, this kind of 5 weeks between Thanksgiving and New Year's. And it's a good time to do that, but it also comes with the complexities of untangling the emotions of what it's like to be human and be working towards big goals all year.
100%. Yeah. So what I want to get to for everybody's listening to this, you and I are going to do some sharing, just some personal sharing of what some of our goals are. We're even going to leave all of you with some of the, just basically kind of step-by-step framework that we, share and use to kind of put our own goals together and plan for the year. And I'd love to start, Aaron, with your own, history of, you've achieved a lot. One of the reasons I want to talk to you about this is like, you've achieved a lot while juggling a lot of things in your life. I think so many people relate to that, being really busy. Has there been as you think about setting goals and frameworks and accomplishing your real estate goals, what are some of the big, ahas or frameworks that have been really helpful for you, just as a good place to start here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you do an incredible job of sharing about longer term goal setting and dialing that down to quarterly sprints. That's an exercise that I started doing in November of 2022. And a friend of mine taught me his process for that. And it was the same process that he used in a corporate environment, but he had created it and adapted it to a personal goal setting context. So that was the first time I had really sat down and made an inventory of all the different things I was doing in my life, all the different things that I wanted to be doing, what each one of those, how much energy they kind of took from me, and what it would take to succeed in each of those. And that exercise on its own was very illuminating as it showed me all the different areas that my energy was going towards.
What were some of the examples when you did that exercise? I just to make that real. Like, what were some of the spaces of your life that you were trying to separate those goals into?
Yeah, so there's a kind of standard buckets, right? First of all, with 3 kids, right, that should and always has remained front and center as my number one responsibility and obligation and honor is to be have a family and try and keep them healthy and provide for them. So that's number one. Obviously, job. It takes energy and time to continue to perform at a level that to not only remain employed but continue to grow in a career. Then there's anything extracurricular, so to speak, like real estate investing at the beginning especially is more or less something that you build on the side, and of course it turns into a living breathing business, but it does occupy time and it does take a lot of energy, especially if you're not using it efficiently. But then of course health and wealth, right? Like these all these different kind of categories, like they require attention, and if you're not intentional about how you think of them, then you're kind of just going to be in firefighter mode all the time, and that's what leads to massive overwhelm and burnout. And I can definitely tell you that from experience. So this exercise we did back in 2022 for the first time, it was really illuminating because it forced me to actually try and quantify some of these things, what they were taking and what it would take to keep moving some forward, including the very difficult exercise of trying to eliminate things that were no longer serving me.
So it's almost like a time audit where you just looked at all the time you're spending in your life and saying, all right, this much is going to this bucket, this much is going to this bucket. And then what did you end up specifically with real estate, which I think is what a lot of people are trying to think about. Like how much time was left over for you to actually buy rental properties and manage that stuff?
Yeah, so it kind of ended up working backwards. The way I think about managing the day-to-day time is around protecting non-negotiables. So I mentioned, first and foremost, my obligation as a husband and a father takes priority. So what I would typically do is try and block the time that belongs to my family. So usually that's dinner time and bedtime and then time in the morning. And then we try to do 1 or 2 activities on the weekend. I fiercely protect that time and only let certain things into it under certain conditions. And I know that if I maintain that discipline towards that priority, then everything else can be filled in around that, and I will still be fulfilling my number one obligation. And so I kind of worked backwards. Like I said, I had those slots for family. I had my day job during the day where I had little pockets of time, but nothing major that I could really commit to real estate. So by working backwards and process of elimination, it kind of ended up to where I only had about 20 to 30 minutes a day to actually spend time on it. I am somebody who has always thought about time management, and you're actually someone who I encountered in my time management journey early on, where I was reading about how you have this kind of maintenance mode where I believe it's about averages of 2 hours a week or so. And It really got me starting to think about, how much time does it really take to do each one of these real estate activities? It feels overwhelming when you're at the beginning because you don't know what you don't know. But for the most part, a lot of the activities, analyzing deals, reaching out to people, engaging on social media, triggering a marketing campaign, this stuff's not super time consuming. It just involves knowledge and then being efficient with how you spend your time. So long way of answering your question, 20 to 30 minutes a day is what was kind of left over. And that's how I designed alongside a business partner of mine, the 20-minute investor time management system. It was born out of necessity because of kind of our circumstances.
So it sounds like you go through this process of just auditing your own life and seeing how much time you have. You come to the reality that, all right, real estate investing is something I want to do, but given my I had this constraint of whether it's 30 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, an hour a day, 2 hours a week, whatever the number might be. That's real. Like I think a lot of people can relate to that. And so then you then say, based on that, I'm going to work my goals, I'm going to work my activities backwards, and so you're having a block of time essentially. You're saying like this is do you with all this stuff, with your family stuff and with your real estate stuff, are you the type of person who like puts that in the calendar, almost like an appointment, and saying this hour is for this thing and this hour is for this thing? And immediately I think some of the objections people might have is like, wow, that feels like super rigid and super structured. Like how does your life, does life feel like you're a robot or something? So can you speak to a little bit of that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I actually relate to that feeling where I tried that. I've gone through a couple other courses and I've worked off other people's templates where they do have you kind of block every component of your day. But again, I've got a day job, but it has its own calendar and its own obligations. I've got the real estate portfolio. I've got family. There's so many different things that I don't have the luxury of blocking my day out and really sticking to super consistent time blocks. So what kind of ended up naturally evolving for me was segmenting a lot of these activities. And I have a way I've come to think of it of offense activities versus defense activities. Offense being anything that contributes to growing your business. So that's, networking, sending offers, analyzing deals, things that would contribute to potentially growing your portfolio in some way or another. And then defense are the types of things that need to be done, not necessarily the sexy work, but it's stuff that maintains and optimizes whatever your current portfolio is. And so the way I started thinking about it is I did still use time blocks, but they were kind of floating. And what I committed to myself was that I would do 20 minutes a day. I would try and pre-schedule them, but I would not hold on so rigidly that they could not be moved. I've found that when I do that, then I found myself constantly disappointed if I didn't do whatever I blocked the time for. And that's where that kind of rigid robotic feeling like just didn't work for me. So instead, I just committed that I will spend the 20 minutes per day. I'm going to bucket it into these two different categories. And then I'm going to kind of have a running list. What happens is throughout the day, like an idea comes to me, oh, I got to go pay that bill, or, oh, I saw this deal come through my inbox. I want to go analyze it. There's all this stuff that kind of just naturally stacks up, especially if you're out there networking and generating interest and leads for your business. So if you're in a purely reactive mode where you just handle everything the second it comes in, it doesn't give you any time to really process and be methodical with your time. So I'm of the account for the time in your day and try and structure it in a way that is intuitive to you, and then slide the tasks in where you can is kind of where I landed.
So how could we name that? It's like a floating bucket, or a floating block. You got a block that eventually you have a list of things that are going to fit into that block, that 20-minute block, but it's kind of sitting on the sidelines, like on deck in baseball. Like you have an on deck batter who's waiting to bat, and as soon as you have that 20 minutes, which might be during your lunch break, I guess it might be during a in between clients or something, or it might be at the end of the day when the kids are in bed. You just know that, all right, as soon as this is game time, I'm up to bat. Now I've got these things kind of waiting for me to get done.
Yeah, I was in a writing program called Ship 30 for 30, where the idea was to write content every day and do it in small enough chunks that you can do it in similarly like a 20 to 30 minute block. And the founder of that course had a concept called sacred hours, which I really appreciated. And he had this little Venn diagram, and the two categories were the time at which you're most naturally productive based on your energy, and the time at which you're least likely to be bothered. And he said, if you can find anything, even if it's 10 minutes in the middle of those, of that Venn diagram, that's the time to try and block. It's not always practical, right? We have jobs and energy fluctuates, but being cognizant of your energy, I don't think all time blocks are created equal. If you try and do a 20-minute time block at 1 a.m. when you're super tired, you're going to get different results than if you do it at a time when you're more naturally geared. So I think that's something to be mindful of too.
Yeah, I found the same thing. For me, it's almost like a energy management more than time management. Is you have to, for me, I'd be curious when yours are, Aaron, but for me, like I have these deep work time blocks. There's a book actually I have in my background there called Deep Work by Cal Newport. It's been one of the most impactful work professional books for me. And it's all about how rare, it's so rare today because everybody's distracted and looking on their phone. Everybody's doing a bunch of shallow work, just a little, sending emails for an hour. Like that's important. You got to do it, but it's not like super deep thinking or writing or in real estate investing, like analyzing stuff or thinking about the next marketing strategy. And so figuring out like these little time, it could be 20 minutes, could be an hour. If you have, when's the best time to have those deep work time blocks? And actually I have a little list of this physical old school planner. And I put on my list for the week, I have little like weekly goals. And one of those is a certain number of hours of deep work. And I know that that's like the number one leading indicator that if I have, for me, it's 18 hours. So that's a lot. So I'm built up to that. That's what I do that's for me, like planning a podcast episode or evaluating a deal or, so these are things I want to be uninterrupted. That's precious time. Like, that's such hard time to get. And so for me, with kids, it was late at night. I'm a little bit more of a night person. I've had to evolve that a little bit because my sleep wasn't doing as well. But for me now, it's like first thing in the morning, drop the kids off to school. And that time is like on Mondays and Fridays in particular, 9 a.m. to 12 or 1 p.m. Like I don't set appointments unless it's just like, only time a doctor could see me or something. Like that is my sacred time to do my deep work. And so I know that's a luxury to have that much time, but it sounds like for you, like when did you find that you could actually fit in those sacred times when you could do this deep work for your real estate or other kind of business stuff?
Yeah, and you say it's a luxury to have deep work time, but I feel that it's more or less a necessity no matter how busy
Yeah,
your life is, because the value that you get out of that time is much greater than the value you get out of the shallow work time, like you
true.
mentioned. For me, it's always like you kind of alluded to, been in the fringes of my schedule. So late at night after the kids are in bed, or it's been increasingly harder, especially I have very young kids, to get up earlier than them and be productive, because you just never know if you plan on that 5 to 6 a.m. One of the kids might get up at 5:15, and all of a sudden your time's shot. So
I can
for
see Aaron
me,
creeping down the hallway, trying not to wake the kids up so you can go type, so you can go write your Twitter post or whatever you're trying to do, right?
exactly, yeah. So I mean, I again try and treat that time with my family as the non-negotiable time blocks where I can, and I have a lot of work to do on this front of being truly fully present during those blocks, but I do protect them from calls and meetings to the best of my ability. So what that leaves me with is late at night, or actually Sunday night, Sunday evening. One of the best routines that I have found, both for real estate and for the rest of my life, has been just doing a 20 to 30 minute Sunday review. And it's a look back. It's a short kind of guided. I have prompts that are in a calendar event that pops up every Sunday evening. And all I have to do is open it up and answer those questions. It could be one word answers, or it could be a whole essay. But I try and fit it in that 30-minute time block so I'm not going over. And what it does is it helps me process whatever I did the week prior. If I had any errors in my thinking of how I would, so let's say I said I was going to go on a full offense blitz and I'm going to send 20 offers this week and whatever, and maybe that goal wasn't realistic. Well, I look backwards and say, what could I have done better? Did I meet the goal? Is there something I could have changed? And then looking ahead, that's where I try and place those 20-minute blocks, at least tentatively for the week ahead. And I organize them, and then I kind of capture whatever, like I call them open loops. We all have so many open loops in our head. It's like
Yeah,
running 500 Google
yeah,
Chrome tabs at the same time, because you have a bunch of half complete tasks. If they just live in your head, they're going to eat you alive, right? So I try and get those out of my head onto a piece of paper or into one of my note taking apps. And then I use those time blocks and I feed those tasks into them throughout the week. I know it sounds like it's hyper organized. It truly is not. It is a pretty
yeah,
flexible
yeah.
methodology, and it's something that has evolved over time based on me trying a bunch of different stuff. So I'm hoping this is helpful.
No, I agree. I was thinking about, like, as we were organizing this episode, like, what are the pillar habits that have, like, over the last 22 years, like, are the best ones that I've used for productivity and goal setting? And I share that one with you. Like, for me, the weekly planning, I usually do minimum 20 minutes. Sometimes if I have a lot going on and I have to process all 500 tabs on my Chrome in my head, it might be an hour sometimes. But Sunday or Saturday afternoon is like my time to do it, and that's like irreplaceable. Like, that has to happen for me if I want to have a good rest of the week. Like, that is such a, like, that and deep work. Am I blocking deep work and doing a weekly planning session on my weekly, like, if I had to, like, pin one or two things that, like, make me super, super productive, that's it. And for me, my weekly planning is very similar to what you do. I like the physical, like, old school planner. I do use a lot of digital tools as well. But for me, it's like getting rid of the phone and just looking at my planner. I've got I have a bucket where I can collect just those open loops, those lists. But then I try to narrow it down to, like, two or three things in each of the areas of my life. And I try to even, like, so for me, it's like I have my Coach Carson business, I have my real estate investing business, I have a Green Crescent Trail, which is a kind of local nonprofit. It's almost like a business too. And then I have personal life. And so there's, like, my four buckets. And I try to narrow it down to, like, two or three weekly action goals for that week. And this is what we do in Rental Property Mastery too, is which you're a coach for a couple of our action teams in there. We try to encourage people every single week for real estate, figure out 1 to 3. If you did one thing this week and you took action, it could be calling a mortgage broker, it could be doing, you going driving for dollars for an hour or two. Like, that's the kind of stuff I put on my list in whatever area of life it is. And then for me, I just like being able to check stuff off the list. And so that hour that I spend, or 20 minutes I spend on Sunday, is deciding out of all the hundreds of things that are on my plate, which one of those are the highest priority, that at the end of the week, when I do the planning again the next Sunday, I'm never 100%, or very rarely 100%. But if I'm like 80% or 90% of those weekly action things are checked off, wow, I've, like, moved it a little bit more forward than it was the week before. And that's progress. Like, that feels like you're always moving forward.
Absolutely. And it's a microcosm of the larger goal setting exercise that you do too, which I know one thing in the action teams in RPM is people kind of a prerequisite for joining the team is that you set some type of quarterly goal. And it can't be 10 quarterly goals. It can't be
Right.
5. I think at most we kind of allow 2.
Yeah.
But even then, you always press, and I try and also do the same, challenge people to really come up with what is the number one thing I can work on this quarter that will have the most like impact on my future goals and be in service of the outcomes that I'm looking for in my life.
Yeah.
And it's that one thing principle. But what you're saying too is that, so that applies at the high level, but also every week you have to challenge yourself. How can I identify the most high value activities, especially if you do not have a lot of time?
100%. Yeah. In a moment, we're going to kind of zoom out here. We started with in the weeds with the time management and the weekly, because I think that's so practical. And I think everybody, we can, and I particularly wanted to share some of the stuff you do, Aaron, which is really helpful. We're going to zoom out in a second to talk about how do you make a year goal and a quarterly goal. But to me, it's just, there's this habit, going back to these kind of pillar habits of filtering out. We all have hundreds of activities, thousands of things, but the most effective people I found that I've tried to model are the ones who can filter out all those things and narrow it down to one thing. Like that book, The One Thing, is another one of my favorite books by Jay Papasan. And it's a really, really good idea of being able to ask yourself in real estate investing this week, if there's one thing that I could get done that would move me forward towards my goal this year, what would that one thing be? And forcing yourself not to have 3 or 4 or 5. It's like number one, and you can add 2 or 3. I have 2 or 3 on my list, but forcing yourself to get 1, then 2, then 3, and then everything else is still somewhere. It's on a piece of paper, but those are not the most important things. You've decided in the quiet of your 20 to 60-minute planning session, those are the most important things. So that when you get frantic, because all of us get frantic in the middle of the week, and you're doing this, and your kid's screaming, and you're going between practices, and your life feels like, it's on fire. You can go back and look at your planner or your digital organizer and say, all right, that's what I told myself was the most important thing. When I get 20 minutes, I'm working on that thing right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add the other side of that coin is when you're doing this weekly review and looking backwards, what are the things I did that I maybe don't need to have done or that I could potentially find a different way to do moving forward? I ask myself that question every single week. And I have this I call it the golden rule, right? If a process is repeatable and does not require any type of advanced decision-making, then that immediately goes on my list of things that I will consider to either delegate or automate. Because in my mind, if it's repeatable and it doesn't involve me specifically, then there's probably better uses for my time than that. And it allows you to go and zoom out and do what I know we're going to talk about next, which is the higher level strategic thinking. And that's where, you hear people talk all the time about wanting to work on their business instead of in their business. To me, that has been the only way to be able to do higher level work while still keeping all these other balls in the air, is to ruthlessly eliminate things that are beneath the floor of where I feel the highest value of my time is.
Can you think of it as a recent example or a good example of something that met the golden rule and you're like, all right, that can definitely be outsourced or automated?
Yeah. So there's some low hanging fruit, right? Like in bookkeeping, even if you do your own bookkeeping, there are rules and automations that you can put in QuickBooks or Stessa or whichever platform you use. So I used to spend one of those 20-minute blocks just going through transactions. And what I realized is that the majority of those transactions were repeated. So I set up rules, and that, started to buy back little bits of time in the margin. And then eventually I just outsourced that entire task to the VA company that I work with. And now they handle all that. And I have a quick one touch. If I get an invoice, I click forward, I send it straight to them. They know exactly what to do with it, where to file it, how to categorize it. And then I'm no longer having to worry about that. And it's such a low cost compared to the benefit of getting that time back that I'm willing to make that investment in tooling or VAs. And there's a lot of stuff you can do that doesn't cost anything. There's a lot of tooling out there in AI. We talked about the weekly review. Instead of making that this big thing in your head that you procrastinate because it feels like a ton of work, you could literally be out on a walk by yourself, dictating into ChatGPT voice memos and just talking about your week, and have it punch up a summary for you that you look at later when you get home. So there's all those different ways of how can I do what I'm doing more efficiently? And also, how can I potentially get rid of or eliminate things that just are not simply the best use of my time?
So you're investing some of your time on the front end in order to start getting returns of saved time down the road. That's really what this is all about, right?
It is. There are rabbit holes you can fall into with tech and tooling and stuff. It's easy to get trapped in over optimizing, But I think if you really boil it back up to the golden rule, which is like, is this task a candidate for either delegation or automation? And if I choose to get it off of my plate, what is the best path to take from there?
Yep.
And that is something I talk a lot about in a workshop that I put together that I'm happy to give to your audience.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and put a link to that, the 20-minute investor. And I know you're generous enough to give that for free. So people can check it out. I'll have a link in there and you can get it. And I think you have one of your worksheets that you do on a week-to-week basis. And some of these things that he was talking about, offense, defense, and how do you organize that stuff, really good templates that Aaron's also taught a class inside of our community, Rental Property Mastery, and you allowed us to use those tools. So it's a really cool stuff that you should definitely check out. All right. So we've talked about the week, almost like the life of a week-to-week investor, and you have 20-minute blocks and you plan it on Sunday. Those are some good best practices. I want to go some step up here. So we're at the end of the year with this quiet time. Hopefully somebody can set aside, listen to this podcast, get a notebook out and start doing some thinking about the entire year. I'm just curious for you. I want to I'll share some of mine too. But first of all, just what are some of your approaches to setting goals for the next year, for the next quarter? Like, how do you get all these ideas and things you're thinking about into like a plan that you can actually execute and make progress on?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually a concept that I've recently learned about that I like from a commercial finance called global cash flow. And it's the aggregation of all the different income sources that you have. And the reason I jump straight into numbers instead of specific goals are you talk a lot about in your goal setting with like setting your different FI numbers and like understanding what the potential financial outcomes that you're aiming for are. And that is one thing that we try and keep in mind for our family is just globally. So across all the different places that we spend money and all the different places that we make money, are we on track to achieve our goals? Those for us in our situation, it might be a little more complex than others, but we have our rental portfolio, we have the small business that we're starting, have W-2s. And so I actually try and it's part of that same exercise I mentioned earlier where lay all the cards on the table, right? Like everything that has any space in your mind, at least at a high level. So if you find yourself thinking that you want to pursue a hobby or you find yourself thinking that you want to go on a big trip, like get it all out so that you can see what you're working with and what's competing for your attention. And from there, like I always try and tie to some sort of future goal or outcome. Because I think one of the mistakes that I've made and that I've seen a lot of other people say that they've made is they lose sight of what they're aiming for. So they start making decisions based on whatever kind of short-term relief they're looking for, and they lose sight of the big picture. So I kind of try and anchor to the longer-term outcomes and then reference all of the brain dump of stuff that I've put out, all these different domains in my life, and then make some decisions, right? Start sliding things around a little bit. Like maybe we know we want to take a vacation. Like in our example for 2026, we said that non-negotiable for us is that my wife and I are going to take a 1-week vacation without the kids. That's very difficult to pull off. So like we're putting that out there as a number one, like personal priority for the health of our relationship. Great. That is a big important thing for us. Second, we want to take a 1-week vacation with the kids, right? So that in the spirit of making the non-negotiables with the family, we wanted to put those markers out first and then fill in the business goals and anything else around that. So that's kind of how I think about it is like, are we able to still live the life that we want to and have the experiences that we want to without sacrificing our pursuit of the longer term outcomes? That's kind of how I frame it in my mind. Obviously, there's a lot of tactical ways to do that.
Yeah, it reminds me of a really good idea. I read one of my favorite self-help books was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, kind of that classic, personal effectiveness book. And the author, Stephen Covey, talked about this. If you had a jar and you wanted to put in a bunch of rocks and a bunch of sand, the order that you put them in is really important. If you poured all the sand in there first and then you put the rocks, it would overflow and fit. But if you put the rocks in first, especially the bigger the rock, the better, put that in first, then the sand can fill in around all the rocks. And that's exactly what you're talking about here is that when you're thinking about you put all these things on the piece of paper or whatever, however you're doing your planning for the next year, you mentioned non-negotiable. It's typically the things that get run over and kind of set aside. If you don't plan them, they're really important, but they're not urgent. Like nobody's going to send you a memo from your work or saying, "Hey, Aaron, you didn't take your vacation with your wife without the kids," or "Hey, you didn't take your nobody but you is going to make that a priority. And so internally you're like, that's the rock. I got to put that in there. I got to schedule it. I got to make an effort to do it. Taxes have to be paid. Like that to me, I mean, that's important, but it's like, that's going to happen. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to get it. Even if I forget to pay my taxes, I'm going to get a notice that says I'm late and I got to pay a penalty. Like, so there are all these things to do, but the things that are most important to you and yet not urgent, I would put exercise and things like that for me. Like improving my sleep, exercising, like on my weekly schedule, like that's my first rock that goes in. Cause like, if I don't figure out when I'm going to do my exercise, it's not going to happen because nobody else is going to like tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Chad, you didn't do your exercise. Let's go." So is that a similar to how you think about it and approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another way to think of that same thing is the way I think about goal setting and the things that I choose to consider as an actual big picture goal are things that require marginal effort above and beyond what I would normally do when I wake up on a given day, right? Like it takes intentional effort to go out and build a real estate portfolio. It's not going to happen automatically. It takes intentional effort to arrange longer bits of time off or vacations. It takes intentional effort to work on your health and really prioritize that. So I do think that's another kind of way I think of it is like if you don't make time for it and if you don't prioritize it, nobody else will. But that also is an indication that it's going to require you to make that commitment and that marginal effort. That's another thing in the action teams that I see a lot is like sometimes people set a goal of something that they were already going to do. Right. And to some extent, I think that's okay. But like you do want to push a little bit and make it so that you're getting at least a little bit uncomfortable to where you're going to make those leaps and find maybe unlock some of the kind of asymmetric growth instead of kind of doing what you were going to do anyway. I do think of it that way as well.
Yeah, that's good advice. So I'm going to give some people like a little bit of a framework on how they can, by the time they finish listening to this, have like a little process to go through to put their own goals together, particularly in real estate for this year. But I want to ask you a question and see your thoughts on this, because I think this is something I've struggled with. I see other people struggling with is when you set your like quarterly or yearly goals, there's this idea you mentioned earlier of like, you have the big picture goals you're trying to accomplish. In real estate, we're talking about financial independence. You're trying to get to financial freedom. And I always equate this like the top of a mountain. It's like I'm standing at the bottom of this big mountain. I'm looking up at the top, and that feels like very unrealistic. Right now I have zero wealth, and I'm trying to get $1 million in wealth or $2 million in wealth, and I'm looking up at the top of that mountain. That feels very overwhelming. So maybe talk a little bit about how you're in the middle of your journey and you made a lot of progress, and you kind of moved up the mountain a good bit. Like, how do you think about going from these big, overwhelming goals that are your kind of life goals, and then narrowing that down to a year or a quarterly goal? How do you approach that?
I'm going to answer this with a little bit of a personal story first, and then maybe a little more tactical. But I, in 2019, went through a inpatient rehab for alcohol recovery, and went on a long journey, for addiction recovery. And in that process, one of the things I learned was the idea of stopping something and thinking about it in this terms of forever, or something that was harder for me to conceive, which is this long, long time period. Like, oh, I'm pretty young. I'm never going to be able to do this again. I know it's slightly different context, but basically what I was doing is I was trapping myself thinking about the future and not allowing myself to be in the moment and recognize incremental progress that happens day over day in your life, especially as you're growing and pushing yourself to do something challenging that needs to be done. So obviously I hope not everyone has to go through what I put myself through to learn that. But I think what I boiled that back down to was living life one day at a time, and knowing that if you're intentional with the way you spend that time, that you should, marginally improve over the course of time. And if you do that consistently enough, that has compounding results. And so I think the exercise of setting these longer term goals, you should keep those in mind, in my opinion, but it shouldn't be the only thing you think about, right? Once you've set that marker, and if you've been thoughtful and strategic with how you define the path to get there, you talk about these telephone pole, stringing one milestone, along one at a time until you get to the final goal, it becomes more digestible. And for me, in that addiction example, I had to train myself, which was very, very difficult, to just live life one day at a time. It doesn't mean that I don't think about the future. It doesn't mean that I don't set goals. It means that I have to be at peace with whatever the outcomes I can get from any individual day. that helped me get better use out of my time. It helped me have a healthier relationship with time, and it helped me release some of the frustration that I had when pursuing larger goals. Because
Yeah.
on a daily basis, you probably can't see the progress, but if you start to zoom out and you look at the big picture, it does come together. The other last thing I'll say is that, if anybody hasn't read the book, The Gap and the Gain, that's a really big Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I think you mentioned another book of his earlier, if I'm not mistaken, but the whole premise of that book is that people spend a lot of time naturally, instinctively thinking about what they don't have and what they want, and oftentimes ignore the progress that they have made. And I think that's another really important reframe that I've had to keep front and center. And it is something that I have to work on every single day. This isn't just something
Yeah.
that you learn once and then it's part of you. Like, you have to make an
Yeah.
intentional effort to really appreciate the moment you're in, appreciate the journey, respect the progress you've made, and wake up the next day and do it all again.
Yeah, that's such good advice. I'll say it another way just to kind of help this sink in is that, I spend a lot of time on this channel. If people watch this, I kind of nerd out on planning and, all right, if you want to get $10,000 a month in financial, and passive income from your real estate, here's how you can work backwards and figure out how much wealth you need. Like, all that's really important. But to your point, like when I'm coaching people one-on-one or inside of rental property mastery, my feedback is always like, let's think about like 1% or 0.5% of our time on that big picture stuff. Like, let's look at the top of the mountain, but then like, let's spend the rest of our time looking at our feet right here. Like, we need to take this step and then this step, because we're going to fall through a crevasse on this mountain if we don't like pay attention. And so I want like to make this practical, and like kind of people can use this as a kind of a goal setting exercise. Like, big picture, if you're on the journey, if you're like a builder and you're trying to grow your wealth, you probably just need to buy more properties. And if you've already bought more properties, you need to work on the operations of your business and the systems and the processes. So I'm willing to bet there's like some very practical goal that you could work backwards from. And I think about this a lot. Like, you mentioned telephone pole goals. I'm not a marathon runner. I'm not an ultra marathon runner. I have a ton of respect for all of you who do that. You're amazing. I'm more of a, basketball player, run 5K and lift some weights kind of person, or I walk a long way. But I'm told that marathon runners, if they think about 26.2 miles when they're like at mile 1 or 2, they'll like devastate their mindset. Like, they'll ruin you. What you really have to do is you have to find the next telephone pole if you're running along a road and say, oh, there's a telephone pole, or there's some kind of landmark, 100 yards out there. I'm just going to get to that telephone pole. And then once I get to that telephone pole, I'm going to find another telephone pole, and I'm going to go to that one, and then on and on and on. So I think that's sort of similar to what you're saying, is that whether you're recovering from an addiction or trying to buy a piece of real estate, like, you can't live your life in this like big, huge staring up at the mountain kind of thing. You got to live your life in the, now in this quarter. And so let's bring this back to like goal setting. And what would be an example for you? Maybe if you want to use a real example this year, or maybe one you used in the last couple of years, like if you narrowed it down to like a quarterly goal or a monthly goal or something, like what would that look like for you inside your real estate business, so people can kind of make that more real?
Yeah. So right now we're working on a very large development project that's a multi-year, multi-phase journey. We're developing 2 assisted living homes that we're going to build from the ground up, and then we're going to operate the business. So I know that's a slightly different journey than a rental property portfolio, but in the spirit of what we were just talking about, it would be very hard to not succumb to all the anxiety that comes with such a high risk project if we weren't able to ground back in the moment and just sequence things out in a way that makes sense to us. So all the chops that we built up trying to do our own planning in our personal lives and in our real estate portfolios leading up to this allowed us to zoom out and take a bigger shot over a longer time horizon. But when you have a 3-year project life cycle and you want to figure out what you should be working on in a specific quarter, that's kind of hard to plan. And if everyone thinks of the semester paper that they got back in college, if you give yourself a semester to do something, 90% of the class is working on it the week before it's due. So when you have 3 years, it's easy to procrastinate a lot of stuff and let things kind of stack. So the way I kind of think about those goals, like, we have different distinct phases of that project. One is like the pre-construction and strategy and design. The second would be the actual construction and development. And then the third would be the operating phase. And so we do a similar exercise where we lay everything out on the table, everything that needs to be done for that business, both now and in the long term. And then we try and make sure that anything that has a longer tail, or like, for example, there's certain software that we're going to have to spend some time learning, and it's going to be a bit of a project. And then hiring staff and things like that are going to be unique challenges that need very explicit, focused attention. And so we're trying to arrange in the course of a year, like, where do these things fit, which quarter? And so it's almost a zoomed out example of this like floating priority time block thing, where as long as you recognize all the things that need to be done, you can arrange them to fit wherever it is best, kind of organically in the bigger picture plan. So I think that's like separating things into phases, and then figuring out like the highest effort, back to that marginal effort comment I made earlier, where, we know that these things are going to require explicit energy, so therefore they have to be worked in as specific goals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you break this big project, this multi-year project, into phases, and then you ask yourself, what's the thing I need to focus on right now, the phase that has to be happening right now in order for the other ones to happen after that. And I'll give another example. So that's a really good example of a project and a development. I coach people a lot with just, they're buying one property. And so think about this, like, you can literally think about like building a house, where you say like the house is the end result, but you have to literally like stack brick by brick. You got to put these little bricks together. And I think about it like that. Like, if you want to buy a house, then you can't just like wave a magic wand and buy a house. If that's what you want to do in the first quarter of next year, for example, you have to break that down into little, you can think about it as projects. I call them like bricks, like separate projects. So when we're coaching people in rental property mastery, we might say, if you want to buy a house, number one, you need to develop a buy box, which you've taught me teach a course on develop your buy box. That would be like the first step. So you have a very clear idea, what is it that I'm going after? And then once you develop that, so that's one project, that might be the first domino you need to set up. And then you need to also work on getting pre-approved for financing. So that might be like either simultaneous or a little bit after the buy box. You work on and the first step of that might be calling a mortgage broker, or might be getting your financing together. Like those would be like a weekly action thing you could do. Spend 30 minutes getting my financial documents together so that I can submit that to a lender. That would be like your week one activity that leads to you getting financing, which leads to you buying a property. And on and on and on. You start with the buy box, you get your financing in line. Then you also, once you get your buy box, you work on how are you going to go find deals. That's a whole project of doing lead generation. So it might be, I get on a list with my realtor who sends me leads every day, or I schedule every week some time to drive for dollars. And then, that's a project, is generating leads to buy the house. And then that kind of leads to this week, when I'm doing my little 20-minute exercise of figuring out what I'm going to do this week, I need to schedule 30 minutes to go look at my listings or make an offer. And so do you have anything to add to that? Because I think that's the essence of what we're talking about here, is there's this like disassembling of a goal, from all the way from the 3-year really long project, or a 10-year goal, down to here's like the different divisions of that goal. I need to do the buy box, I need to do the financing, and then all the way down to this week, what's the 1 or 2 or 3 things that I could do to move me forward?
Yeah, no, I think in both of those examples, sequencing and prioritization are the kind of underlying themes, right? Like, it's taking the bigger goal, and not only the goal of like what you want to do. What you want to do is buy a rental property, but how does that tie to the big picture outcome? Maybe your big picture outcome is you want $10,000 a month in net cash flow from your rental properties. So making sure there's some link between the tactical achievement and then the broader outcome. But when you pull it back in, like you said, and you can get a clear vision of what should I work on this week that will be in service of my quarterly goal, it sounds highly engineered, but it's really not. It's a bit of methodical planning at the beginning of the quarter, and then some calibration, ideally week over week, in something like a Sunday review, like what we talked about. And the other thing I wanted to point out is it allows you to spot specific tasks or things you can do that have leverage on the time. So building a buy box, if you spend a week building a buy box, or 2 weeks, or however long it takes you to do that research and feel really solid and certain about what you're going after, well, now, and you use one of Coach's buy box letters so that you can clearly communicate that out broadly to a group of people in an organized manner. Well, that's a leveraged activity. That week you spend on the buy box, you can now communicate your buy box almost instantly to a broad group of people, right? So like, by doing one set of activities, it reduces pressure on your time, which is probably all of our most scarce resource. So I do think that the sequencing and the breaking down of goals allows you to locate the areas that have potential for time leverage, either freeing up your own time or potentially, again, using that golden rule and outsourcing it to either software or potentially assistance.
So one thing I want to do, Aaron, is I feel like we've given a lot of ideas about planning and structure and, planning your week or your year and setting your goal, but I want to give people permission to make some mistakes with this. And one thing that comes to mind for me is that, like, when I actually get into a week, I start with a plan, and then life happens, and it's almost like you jumped on this horse, and it's like a bucking bronco, and you're just like hanging on for dear life. And I feel like that's more realistic about what life is actually like. You do your weekly planning, you do your planning for the day, and then chaos erupts and life happens. And so if any of you feel like that, if you feel like I'm listening to Aaron and Chad and they sound like they're just, these robots of perfection on their planning, like, it's not that way. I'm speaking for myself. I don't know, Aaron, do you feel, if you say if you feel the same way, but I just want to give people permission not to be like, be perfect with this, whether you're setting your yearly goals or your weekly goals. The point is to plan. And then they say that man plans, God laughs. That's kind of like the way the world works. But the process of planning, I feel like, is very useful for that reason, because then when you do get chaotic and you fall off the horse, you get back on, you at least have some sort of organization of what you intended to have, and you can get back on and make some progress.
I couldn't agree more. I think it is a complete fallacy to think that you can plan at this level of detail and actually execute exactly the way you planned. And that is not in any way what I am insinuating. I think of it more as these are guardrails. It's a forcing function to be intentional about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and whether it's in service of an outcome that you have decided is important to you and your family, right? So for me, it's a grounding exercise more than it is a tactical precision exercise. And to your point, like, my schedule goes out the window basically every day, but I know that I am protecting those non-negotiables. I do bedtime with my kids. I make sure not to let those things slip. And if I go out of town on a trip, or if I have something that breaks into those time blocks, of course that happens. Like, it's, again, unrealistic to assume that you can protect all those time blocks 7 days a week, 365 a year. But by just even being intentional about thinking that way about my time, it has made me a much better father, husband. It has allowed me to continue to fill these different cups in my life because I had the thought and intention of approaching that way in service of those goals. So I think of it more that way than I do this is a 24/7 plan time block that I just float between, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost like we're experimenters, we're scientists, and the science experiment is your life. And in this case, we're talking about a year or a quarter or a week, like we talked about earlier. That's the science experiment. You have a hypothesis that it's going to work this way, and then you get into the experiment, and you're like, well, that didn't work. Let me go back to the drawing board. Oh, that didn't work either. Let me go back to the drawing board. Like, that is being a human being, and that is being an entrepreneur. Is just the process of bumping into the wall, saying that didn't work, bumping into the wall, that didn't work. And I just think that's so important, because when you talk about time management, planning, setting goals, like, it can come across sometimes as very like you just figured the path out from the beginning. Whereas if you actually looked at a graph of how somebody actually succeeded at their weekly task, their yearly task, or whatever it is, it's more like this zigzag line where you went 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, and then another 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And it takes a lot of persistence, and also the being okay with that messiness. And if you're not okay with it, and you think Aaron's perfect or Chad's perfect, then you're going to have the illusion that you need to be perfect too. And it's just not the case.
Absolutely. And one more illustration of this, right? So I came on this podcast, I think it was about 18 months ago. And I remember at the end of the show, you asked me, what am I up to and what's kind of on the horizon? Not a single word was mentioned about memory care or development or anything, right? And now that is essentially the big bet that my wife and I are making for the next 10, 20 years of our future, right? So that has all materialized in the last 18 months. I mentioned that I started doing these planning exercises back in 2022. So clearly that wasn't always my big life plan, but we did allow our goals, like our end outcome of having financial freedom and flexibility for our family, so that we don't squander the golden years where our children are at an age where they actually want to spend time with us. That is the outcome we're aiming for. and we re-engineered the vehicle that's going to get us to that outcome. And that's how we ended up doing this project, right? So it's just a good illustration of what you're talking about, where like you have to allow yourself to be flexible and evolve with the arc of your life, whatever that may present to you, and not just assume that you're going to follow a linear path for 20 years, because I don't know anybody that has.
No, exactly. All right. I want to give everybody some takeaways. So hopefully this has been helpful. You're listening to this and you're like, all right, I'm going to get my notebook out. I'm going to take some notes. I'm going to get my computer out and do some thinking, some planning, either for the next week or for the next year. Aaron, what would you give if you had to like boil this all down for someone who's wanting to take that, to work on that for the next hour or so? What would you recommend them to kind of run away with this and actually make some progress on it?
Yeah, I feel like a broken record when I keep talking about this kind of end outcome. But I do think that a lot of times people get lost in the weed of trying to pick the perfect strategy, or they let the strategy dictate the outcome instead of letting the desired outcome evolve into the right strategy. So I always encourage people, if you don't have a really crystal clear idea of what you want your life to look like 3, 5, and maybe even 10 years from now, knowing full well that will probably change, if you can set that directional certainty, then it's going to make a lot of the other planning and goal setting so much easier. Because when a goal is in service of an outcome, it is a lot easier to stick to. It's a lot easier to understand and see the big picture of how it all fits together. And every day when you have to wake up and make that commitment, because it is an everyday thing, you have to wake up and recommit every single day. It's going to be a lot easier when you know that it's driving towards an outcome that is truly meaningful to you.
Yeah, it's your why, or the t-shirt I wear a lot. It's your what matters to you, like that thing that matters to you even more than real estate. Like what's the life you mentioned? You're spending time with your kids and the time they still want to spend time with you. For me, that was my wife and I traveling. We wanted to. My wife's a Spanish teacher, and so we wanted our kids when they were young to be able to speak Spanish. And but even before we even had kids, like there was just this inkling of just a feeling, or I want to have some freedom to do some things that are outside the box. I want to have like this flexibility and this, optionality to do things that people can't normally do. And I need money and financial freedom and flexibility to do that. And so that was like the burning kind of why. But then when you are setting the goal this year of, okay, to do that, I need to buy another rental this year. Well, that could sound kind of dry or boring for some people, but if you're like burning with like, hey, I want to make this happen for my family, then that's what I hear you saying, Aaron, is that like that kind of fire generates a lot of the motivation you need to then run into the wall 5 times and step back and deal with this chaos and set the plans again and fail at this thing, but get back up again. Like that's the heroic journey of an entrepreneur. Like that's the real thing, but you got to have your eye on the prize. Otherwise it's not gonna happen.
And make sure to enjoy the ride, right? Like we do make sacrifices, of course, like when you pursue ambitious goals, but sacrificing doesn't mean you have to suffer, right? Like if life is not, if you're making sacrifices and it's causing damage to your health or your relationships that's not acceptable to you, nobody is forcing you to do that, right? Like that's where you make those adjustments and corrections. So as fun as all this tactical stuff is, at the end of the day, like you do have to manage how you feel and your ability to make it through the marathon. Because that in and of itself is a journey. So I would also challenge people, don't get too caught in the weeds of all the tactical stuff. Like focus at the end of the day on how you feel and where you're going.
Well, if people want to connect with you, we've talked some about rental property mastery. I always have a link in the show notes in the podcast YouTube description. You can check out, apply for rental property mastery. We have a few spots that open up every month, and Aaron's one of our coaches in there. I, of course, am in there as well. But there's some other places you do a lot of work online. You share stuff online. You have a 20-minute investor.com that we're going to put on there that has a lot of free resources. Where else can people hang out with you, Aaron, if they want to stay connected?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to reach. As Chad mentioned, I have the 20-minute investor. So if you go to 20minuteinvestor.com, you can get a workshop that I ran with my business partner that goes through this, not only the tactics, but also the theory behind it. And it comes with a lot of giveaways, like different workflows, some trackers that you can use to actually implement the 20-minute investor system. So that's something I would love to share with your audience. As Chad mentioned, I'm also in RPM as one of the action team coaches. So I work with small groups and help them similarly implement and stay accountable to their goals throughout the quarters. Can't speak highly enough of RPM. It's an incredible community. Chad is a wealth of knowledge, but also just the culture and the community in there is unrivaled, in my opinion. great group of people and a lot of people supporting each other along the way. So you can find me in there if you're an RPM member or want to be one. And also go to 20minuteinvestor.com if you want those freebies. And my email and everything will be in there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Aaron. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing your journey with the whole project you're building and developing. I'm so excited for you on that. And I'll be watching to see how your goals go in 2026.
Thanks for having me on.